Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Pandemic and Economics, the coffee and research series of the Department of Economics. Every Thursday in March, we look at the consequences of the pandemic from an economical point of view, and I'm very, very happy that you're joining us again today. Today, I welcome Christian Ruff. He's professor of neuroeconomics and decision neuroscience. Christian will be talking why we comply with social norms. Well, such norms are key for peace and productivity in organizations and societies, but still sometimes we have a hard time to comply with such norms, and therefore also the questions, why do we comply with some and not with others? So Christian, you will answer this question from a neuroeconomic perspective and also present us the corresponding brain mechanism. This in a few seconds. We are looking forward to it. Ladies and gentlemen, well, you also have the opportunity to ask questions in a very simple way. It's also online. Please open your internet browser and visit menti.com, and then there will be like an opportunity to insert a code that is currently shown on your screen below. And Christian Ruff will be happy to answer as many questions as he can after his presentation. And now I hand over to you, Christian. Go for it.
Thank you. Good morning also from my side. As Eileen already said, in the next 20 minutes of your morning coffee, I'm going to give you an overview of our research on why we comply with social norms. In these times of COVID, we constantly have to question our social norms, all these rules and regulations that tell us how we ought to behave in given situations, and that cover so many aspects of our behavior, ranging from very mundane things, such as how we greet each other, what we wear in different situations, to quite high-level moral things, such as rules such as that we should share if we have enough with others, or that we should in particular help and protect those who are weaker than we are. Now, such norms are not static. They obviously change over time. You can easily appreciate that if you consider that 200 years ago we greeted each other by kissing our hands. We wore quite funky hats, and if someone made a joke at our expense, we didn't laugh, but we challenged them to a duel. It's natural that norms change, but during these times, what was really, really drastic is how quickly and how drastically we had to change our norms. Norms that are centuries old had to really be adapted over the course of weeks. It's amazing to see that we're able to do this, but as Eileen already pointed out, it wasn't always easy, and problems continue to the present day. So I want to talk with you about three fundamental questions. Why are we even so flexible in complying with new norms? How can we do this? Why is it easier for us to comply with some norms than with others? And then how can we as a collective society ensure norm compliance when it matters? Now, these questions are very important, and one could take many different perspectives: history, psychology, sociology. All of this is important, but I want to focus on my research area, neuroeconomics. And our starting point is biology. We think that norm compliance is a part of human nature, and it has been shaped by evolution. The starting point is we humans aren't particularly special. We aren't particularly big, particularly strong, particularly fast. Other animals are better at that than we are. But we have one skill that's key, and that is we can flexibly team up with others, and we can divide labor, we can assign roles, and work towards a common goal. And because this has been key to our success as a species, over the centuries, over the thousands of years, we believe that this has led to the evolution of specific brain mechanisms that allow us to flexibly take on these behaviors, and that are really particularly human. And I want to talk with you today about 5 such mechanisms and how these mechanisms may explain norm compliance, in particular in these times. The first of these mechanisms is what we call social learning. And what I mean by that is that we have a natural tendency to imitate the behavior of other people around us. Those of you who have children know that kids don't really do what you tell them to do. They do what you do, and they do in particular what their peers do. But this is not just restricted to children. Grown-ups do that too, as we can clearly see with all these behaviors that go viral, right? And they have very strong effects even on our economy. The US is suffering a feta shortage at the moment because everyone wants to eat one particular pasta dish, and the stock markets go wild too because people imitate the behavior of others. And what's crucial is this social learning doesn't only work for behaviors that make sense, or behaviors that people think give them an advantage. We just have this tendency. And it's believed that this tendency can explain how norms can spread so rapidly across a society. And I think we could see that very clearly with the norm of handshaking. It's a very, very old, very dominant norm in our society. A couple of years ago, a Swiss court even ruled that everyone has to do it, irrespective of their religious belief. But within a matter of weeks, we could come up with new ways of greeting each other. There were some alternatives, but then we very quickly started to converge on one of them. So social learning is key for us to learn and adapt to new norms. Now, if it were only so easy, the problem is it isn't. With norms that don't go against our self-interest, that are easy for us, social learning is very effective. But there's quite some other norms that go against our self-interest. And here we need another mechanism, moral impulse control. Consider the example of now having to wear a mask and having to socially distance. This obviously now is a behavior that goes against our self-interest. We want to mingle with others. We want to be in social groups and have direct interactions, but we cannot. We have to follow these new norms. So our brain does need a mechanism that allows us to resist this temptation, to actually just follow our self-interest and to basically follow these rules. Fortunately, evolution has endowed us with such a mechanism. We've studied that recently in the laboratory with the example of honesty. We invited people and gave them the opportunity to basically lie for personal benefit. They had to roll dice 10 times. Some outcomes, 1, 2, 3, for example, gave money. The others didn't give money. We didn't know what the outcome was. They had to report it. So there was this conflict. Should I stick to the norm and tell the truth? Or should I perhaps lie to gain money? Now we know that when people are in such a situation, then there's one brain area or a set of brain areas that's activated in the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, basically here. So we thought, can we perhaps, by stimulating this area, by making it more excitable, help people to be more honest? So that's what we tried. In a situation where people were not stimulated, you can see that people were able to resist the temptation somewhat, but they lied. In black, you see the distribution of payoffs that you would expect if people were honest. You can see that the real distribution that we saw in white actually is shifted towards the higher payoffs. This means people did lie from time to time, but they didn't lie all the time. They still stuck to the truth somewhat. Now, when we stimulated this brain area, you can see now the data here in dark gray, people became significantly more honest, meaning that this mechanism that we stimulated allows us in these situations to stick to the norm, to not resist resist the temptation successfully. Now there's one problem, and that problem is that there's always a few people who don't seem to have that mechanism, who lie completely and who don't even experience this conflict. And this is a fundamental problem that we have, not just because these people are around and break the norm, but because we, when we see people breaking the norm, also have the tendency to break that norm as well. There's many experiments that show in the lab that if you put people in a situation where they need to cooperate, but there's people around who don't cooperate, cooperation breaks down over time. Another problem is we don't even just need to see other people break the norm to break it ourselves. If we experience ourselves breaking the norm, then this emotional reaction that we have gets weaker and weaker, and we break the norm more and more. There's interesting experiments. I can't tell you the details, but I'm happy to answer questions later about this. So the bottom line here is we have moral impulse control. We can stick to norms when they go against our interests, but the mechanism is somewhat fallible. And I think that could be one of the reasons why perhaps after a period of initial norm compliance, people start falling back into their old habits. So we need some other mechanisms, and one crucial one here is now what's called altruistic punishment. And this means we have a natural tendency to be very sensitive to norm violations. If we see others violate the norm, we feel bad and we're motivated to do something about it, to right the wrong. We derive satisfaction basically to put people back into their place so that they follow the norm. This can be studied in the laboratory. So if you invite, for example, two people and you give one of them a sum of money, 100 francs, and tell them that they can divide it as they see fit between the two players. So they can give something, an amount X to player 2. And you give player 2 the option to respond. So player 2 can say, yes, I accept this money. In this case, this is implemented. So if player 1 gives 20 francs, player 1 gets 80 and player 2 gets 20. But player 2 can also say, no, I'm not taking these 20. You can, in this case, both players get nothing. What this means is player 2 can actually punish player 1 for breaking the norm. And you would say that's quite irrational, because effectively, why should you give away free money? But that's what people do. You can see here that if people give 40 or 45%, people accept quite a lot. The height of the bar means how often people reject the offer, how often they punish. But if people give, for example, 25 francs or 10 francs, people start rejecting this very often, showing very clearly that each of us basically has a little police in our brain who basically reacts strongly to seeing norm violations, and we want to basically right the wrong. Now the thing is, you could say, we don't do that all the time. We don't actually punish ourselves all the time. So how exactly does this lead to norm compliance? Well, this is a function of the fourth mechanism that I want to talk today. We are very sensitive to the knowledge that other people have this tendency. We know that other people will basically see what we do and will react to it. They will punish us if we break the norm. You can show this very clearly in this very same experiment that I just talked about before. If we now focus on player 1, the person who gets the money, and we look how much money do they actually give in a situation where they can be punished, where they know that the other player can react, or in a situation where the other player cannot respond, then you can see that the behavior changes drastically. In the condition where the other player cannot respond, which is called control condition on the slide here, people only give about 10 to 15%. They don't follow the norm. A little bit, perhaps. They give a bit, but not half what would be fair. As soon as they know that the other player can respond and can actually punish, immediately player 1 gives about half, 40 to 50%. So it means we have the knowledge that there are people around us that they're basically reacting to our behavior and sending us these social signals which effectively help us comply with the norm collectively as a group. And I just want to point out again that we've shown also with such a brain stimulation experiment that there is such a mechanism in our brain and that it can be changed by brain stimulation for a short time at least. And what I found particularly interesting about the results of this experiment is that this mechanism only works in social situations. So only when another person is there and actually watches the behavior and issues the punishment, only then is this mechanism changed by brain stimulation. When a computer issues this punishment, it's effectively non-social, you lose the same amount of money, but it's not a social signal, then this mechanism is not affected by the stimulation. And that tells us something about the nature of the social sanctions that we have. So in end effect, it does make sense to actually say in some situations when norm compliance is really important that we help ourselves by basically sending to ourselves a social signal that this is really important for us by saying, don't break this norm. If you break the norm, there will be social consequences. And it doesn't actually matter so much how much money it is or so. What matters much more is that it's a clear social signal. However, there's again a catch here. What's extremely crucial is that these sanction signals are credible. As soon as we see that people don't actually follow them, such as in the example here when the Ständerat was just after saying that people should wear masks, was singing a song without masks and posting that on social media, we react to that very, very strongly. We immediately feel the need to actually right this wrong. This goes back to this altruistic punishment. So this is something that we shouldn't do. When we say very clearly that we don't want particular behavior in a society, we need to be very consistent in the social signals that we send. Now let's come to the last mechanism. So until now, everything looks very straightforward, right? We observe the behavior of others, we copy the behavior of others. If this goes against our self-interest, we have a mechanism that helps us to resist the temptation to break the norm. And there even are the other people around us who help us in this by sending these social signals, this intricate mechanism. So why is it that still in many societies, at least some parts of society don't follow norms? This has to do with a tendency of humans that's called parochialism. What parochialism is we have a tendency to form smaller groups and to define us as these smaller groups by particular norms that we maintain. We want to distinguish us from others. It's a so-called us versus them mentality, or tribal mindset. That's what it's sometimes called. And the problem is that as soon as different subsections, different subgroups form in society that claim that they have their own way of doing things and their own norms, then this can lead sometimes to strong norm violations, in particular against members of the other group. This is something that we saw quite clearly in the US, in the case of the capital rights, for example, where one of the strongest norms that we have, that we shouldn't hurt others, that we shouldn't harm others, basically was violated repeatedly against members of what people perceive to be the other group. You might say this is pretty drastic. We don't really have that here in Switzerland. Well, people in our department did a study where they invited fans of FC Zurich and FC Basel and allowed them to basically see other people experience mild but still painful electric shocks. And they gave them the option to help these people, to take some of the electric shocks for themselves. You may be surprised to hear that just the fact whether the person you are watching was a fan of the same football club as you or of a different football club strongly changed behavior. For fans of the same football club, people were much more willing to help and really didn't want to see it, in fact, that this other person experienced these shocks. Whereas for a member of the opposite football club, it was the opposite, in fact. People didn't want to help so much, and they more often chose to actually watch. So these tendencies are, of course, quite dangerous, because it means that in the case of norm compliance, when there's collective norms that we really want people to follow, if these groups form, these tribes form, and in particular, if they take this norm as a social signal, if they say this norm defines us, I am in the part of society that does wear masks, or I'm in the part of society that doesn't wear masks, then we have a problem, because then effectively our ability to collectively regulate our behavior is ruptured. It's not really possible anymore, in a way, to have constructive dialogue and to rapidly coordinate our behavior if we need to shift to new norms. So this is a problem. So I basically have presented you now with these 5 different mechanisms that we have. And I want to use the last 5 minutes to talk a little bit about how we could use this knowledge to facilitate norm compliance when it matters. If you now think, so what do we do in Switzerland in effect to actually cope with the current situation? I think what we do fairly well is that we have quite clear communication. We have clear rules, we communicate them, but then I think we largely leave the individual up to decide how exactly to follow this. And this is working reasonably well, but some people also criticize that it may not be working well enough. So what could we do? How could we use these mechanisms? Well, one thing is, I think we need to harness the power of social learning much more. I think other countries have shown that if you actually make behaviors that make sense from a public health perspective, if you allow them to go viral by coupling them, for example, with fun songs or with particular social media challenges, such as the ice bucket challenge that some of you may remember, then such norms spread much more rapidly and people are much more willing to just engage in them. So this is something I think we could do. I already mentioned that in principle, it does make sense that we signal quite clearly by rules and regulations what we want people to do just for the collective greater good. I definitely am a fan of the fact that here in Switzerland we have strong local ties and we have a cantonal mindset and that every canton decides what they do. But the problem is a little bit, of course, that if there's no overarching clear rules, then it may become a little bit more dangerous or a little bit more difficult, actually, to make sure that the norms are followed when it really matters. And in particular, if we see that some other people who we see to be part of our group don't have to follow the rules, but we have to follow the rules, then this goes against our natural interests. So I think clear consistency here would be very, very important. Another thing I want to mention is, again, parochialism. I think we definitely need to avoid that society starts to splinter up into interest groups, into norm groups, into groups where people say they do it, but we don't. This is very, very bad. So I think any kind of rhetoric that starts to create a us versus them mentality, for example, the politicians versus the people, or these cantons versus these cantons or something, really is counterproductive. We do need this capital that we have, the fact that we can very quickly and flexibly all comply with the same norms if it matters, and we really cannot allow this to break up. This is not meant to indicate that we shouldn't discuss. Quite the opposite, actually. It is extremely healthy and important that we have different opinions and that we really go in and try to understand the arguments that everyone has for their perspective. There's a lot of research on this at the moment where people in the US are trying to break up this impasse between the different mentalities on the political left and the political right. And this research has come to the conclusion that the only way that you can break this up is that if you really try to understand the arguments that the other side is making, and that you really take this into account and acknowledge it. So what I really don't want to convey here is the message, oh, we just need to send social signals that we're going to punish and show people something and then they're going to learn it. No, we need to engage in dialogue, and we need to make sure that all concerns are seen as valid and are worked through. And once this is the case, then you can quite powerfully actually change attitudes. And I want to finish with a paper that people at our institute published recently that showed exactly this, that even a very, very dominant, very deeply ingrained attitude that people have. This is now about female genital cutting in Sudan, a very, very strong norm and attitude that particular parts of society there have. And people are really thinking, how can we possibly change this? And so they tried different things, and what they came up with was an ingenious, you could say, intervention that combined several of these principles. They actually produced a soap opera. So it was something that people enjoyed watching, social learning. The soap opera featured members of this particular society. So there was no one from the outside telling people what to do. It was people watching people from their own community, parochialism. And in this soap opera, it wasn't just simple social learning. It's not that these people said, we don't want to cut, but they really went through the conflict. They discussed in detail all the pros and the cons, and they veered towards one way or the other. And in the end, in this soap opera, this family decided not to actually cut. And this particular manipulation shows that all of these things that I mentioned really can work very, very strongly to change even very deeply ingrained attitudes and norms. And I really hope that we as a society can really use the spirit to combat all the challenges that lie ahead of us with COVID, because as in the millennia that came before us, we do need the ability to cooperate and follow norms to actually succeed in beating the coronavirus. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing the talk with you.
Thank you so much, Christian. Dear ladies and gentlemen, we open the Q&A. Questions are welcome now. As mentioned earlier, we use menti.com, so if you have any question, then please insert and write it down and send it to us. Well, I'll have a look at the questions. Of course, there are always a lot of questions coming up, especially with such an interesting area, Christian. So we are still in the middle of the pandemic, and I mean, the big discussion currently is vaccination. So the first question is also goes in this direction. So the next challenge in this crisis that we have is the vaccination question. So how can we as a society ensure people take up the vaccinations?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. This is basically now a problem again of people adopting something new as a norm. I think at the moment the question about vaccination, we always talk a lot about the question of personal liberty, of people having the choice. Whoever wants to can basically vaccinate themselves. And by that we really shift the focus away from the other values that actually are associated with vaccination, basically the norm of protecting others. You know, it's not just about us having free choice. Vaccinating yourself means that you're actually helping to eradicate the disease, you're helping to avoid further mutations, you're helping to protect those who are weak. And I really think just by shifting, for example, the discussion on this aspect, rather than constantly talking about, oh, what do we do with people who don't want to? That's one thing. The second thing, of course, is, I mean, here again, social signals. Right? So I think if we just make it very, very clear that people who actually follow this, what we probably have to instill as a new norm, vaccination, otherwise we don't beat the disease. If people follow this, then there are going to be positive social consequences. So people will basically be able, they will benefit from this. They will be able to mingle again with friends, they will be able to go out, so forth. I think things like this are underway with this new digital vaccination certificate and so forth. It just all sounds a bit too technical to me. It sounds too much, like a passport or something. I don't think we should. I think we should be talking positively about this. We should really point out what the positive things are that are associated with this. And then people, when the incentives are clear and it's associated with positive values, not with a negative conflict, then it's fine. Last but not least, of course, people who are hesitant have doubts. Perhaps they think we don't know enough or something. So what is, of course, absolutely crucial is that we give people the adequate knowledge about the vaccinations, of course, and that we really take these doubts very seriously. We can't just brush them off the table. We have to work through pretty much what I said before. But I think as soon as we do that, I'm optimistic that we should be able to instill this new norm.
And also to communicate, as you mentioned earlier, it's a lot about communication and showing all the advantages.
Social signals and emphasizing norms, putting values and norms, positive ones, in the forefront.
Let's look at the other questions, Christian. You focus a lot on universal behavior that underlies norm compliance. So does culture not play a role? Do people really behave in the same way all over the world?
So people, of course, don't behave exactly in the same way all over the world. These mechanisms that I talked about, these behavioral tendencies, they are universal. It's true. No matter where you are, developed societies or developing societies, different cultures, people do show social learning, they show altruistic punishment, they show all these things that I talked about. However, the norms themselves that have evolved, they may differ very, very strongly, right? And I mean, I think we can see that with some of the norms that we talked about. For example, the norm of how we greet each other. People have a particular symbol, how they greet each other all over the world. That norm has evolved everywhere. But in our spheres, we shake hands. In other spheres, for example, people, show this particular sign, which we could have chosen as well, actually, as an alternative way of greeting. But somehow we didn't do it. I found that very interesting. My kids came home and showed me that in school, they basically now actually do this particular form, which is from Asia, right? I found it great. I thought it's much better, actually, objectively, than the elbow bump. Yeah. But again, perhaps there's a little bit of parochialism at play here. We just don't want to adopt norms or customs of other cultures. We rather come up with new ones.
Very interesting. Let's go to the next question. So it's about age. The brain changes with age. Is there a difference between younger and older people, or older people less flexible to adapt?
Okay, so in general, of course, there are differences in behavioral control and norm compliance, in particular, between very young and middle young and old people. Children, for example, first have to learn these norms, right? Everyone who has children knows that the concept of fairness and sharing does take quite a while to actually show up in kids. Now, there have been systematic studies that have looked how compliance with particular norms changes over the lifespan. Yeah? And there are slight differences. So older people, for example, tend to be a little bit more altruistic. They tend to share a little bit more. But the differences aren't as drastic as we think. I think in general, adapting to new norms, as with any other behavior, of course, learning the motivation to learn and to adopt new custom changes over the lifespan, and it is definitely true. Everyone knows that from observation, that the older we get, the less likely we are to adapt to new technologies, to new customs, to new norms. So I think the answer here has to be, unfortunately, yes. I think these times are probably quite challenging, in particular for older people who just have more established ways of doing things.
Mm-hmm. Let's look again into the topic of the vaccination. So how do we shift from a society that is for self-deciding about vaccine to one with a majority asking for a vaccine obligatory and punishment within 1 year? And is there a way back?
So I don't actually think that we should phrase it as shifting away from personal liberty to a society that forces people to vaccinate. I think that's exactly the wrong perspective to take here. I think the perspective to take is more that we have to emphasize what's positive about the vaccination, and we have to take serious the fears and the problems that people see with vaccination, and we have to really convey the message and get it clearly across that these concerns, even though we understand them, are not valid. I think ultimately everyone will have to decide for themselves. So just by shifting the mindset away from saying people are forced to be vaccinated to basically a mindset where we say our society, our common good, basically we can only really participate in it freely without endangering ourselves and others if we vaccinate. I think it's the same as with, say, driving with a seatbelt, right? If you approach this from the perspective and say, well, someone's forcing me to wear a seatbelt, I don't want to, then it's difficult. But if you understand the concept behind a seatbelt and why it makes sense, and it's actually not that bad to put on a seatbelt, we do it automatically and it's not a problem.
Let's continue with the next question. We have a lot coming in. Let's look at Europe. Why did Europe react only at Italy's lorry pictures and not at the Chinese news? Parochialism question, or too far away?
I would say that both of these things probably make sense. So I mean, we have to see it in a historical perspective. There have been local epidemics in Asia, right? There was SARS, for example, and it didn't really move over to us. So people may have learned perhaps a little bit that if something happens in another part of the world, it does take time to come over, and perhaps it doesn't come at all. Yeah? That's certainly one part of it. It actually also explains perhaps why Asia is coping so much better currently with the pandemic, because they learned that this is not true. If something happens somewhere, you know, like, I mean, China is a big place, and if something happens in Hong Kong, right, it can still spread. You could still think that it takes a long time to spread somewhere else. But in Asia, I think people learned during these epidemics that they're really unpredictable, that things can happen very fast, quickly, that you can never feel secure, right? So I think learning from the past plays a role. As to whether or not it is parochialism, I don't really know, but it is, of course, an unfortunate perhaps part of human nature that we tend to help and share more with others that we feel closer to. That's a fact. Many experiments, many examples from history, so this may have played a role too.
Thank you for this answer, Christian. So let's take another one or two questions. Sometimes social norms are not enough. So how effective are fines when it comes to corona measures? How high do they have to be taken seriously?
Important point. I tried to move a little bit into this territory. So social sanctions, threats, fines, as I said, are important. They are important in situations where it's just too tempting for us to break the norms. So when fines are in place, we know automatically, that's part of our nature, that society really takes that seriously. And what matters most is not that someone says, oh, there is a sanction. What matters is that you actually see that that sanction really is implemented also when someone breaks the norm. I think that's more important than the actual height of the fine. Of course, there's a certain social signaling value in that as well. So if we say something costs 1,000 francs if you break the norm, or it costs 20 francs, you do infer that the first norm is more important. But it's, I really want to get that point across. The material consequences are really less critical for changing our behavior than the feelings that we have of being corrected by other people around us. It's these social signals that really matter, and that we're very sensitive to even without being punished in the first place. Just knowing that this can happen and will happen helps us.
So let's come to the last question, Christian. What influence does the conflict between minorities and the majority in society have when it comes to social norms, which are, after all, also culturally shaped?
Yeah, so that's a very, very big question. So the dominance of norms, learning of norms, contradistinction of norms. In the literature, it has been shown, or has been simulated as well with simulations, that different parts of society can define themselves by norms, and these norms actually ironically, they get stronger if they're challenged. So if there's a part of a society that defines themselves by a particular custom or a particular norm, the more the others don't like it or try to basically just influence it in some ways, the more people cling to it because it's a defining feature of their society. And that leads, of course, if we look at the world, to some unfortunate circumstances where norms in minority groups can be very, very strong and very pervasive, and they cling to it. And in countries where people are not as fortunate as we are here, that everyone's protected to have their own free opinion and norms, then the majority tries to revert to very drastic measures often to actually eradicate these norms. But people still cling to them. It's a very, very strong force, the sense of identity and sense of clinging to your norms.
Christian Ruff, thank you so much for being here this Thursday morning and for all those valuable insights you have been sharing with us and also with the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the third session, Coffee and Research. Next week again, it will be the last session, Coffee and Research of the Department of Economics, then with junior scientist and economist Mathilde Lemoine. She will share with us the latest results of her research on the impact of COVID on the international trade. So she will be comparing the first wave with the second wave of the pandemic and also showing us the distinct impacts across regions and also sectors. So global trade in times of COVID-19, that's a topic of next week. I hope that you will be joining us again next Thursday, 8:30 a.m. And if you need more information, then just quickly visit the website of the Department of Economics. It's econ.uzh.ch. I thank you so much. And from my side, have a good day. Hopefully see you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.